The afternoon of March 12th, 1936, was cool and overcast in Harlem, with temperatures in the mid-40s and gray clouds suggesting rain might arrive before evening. By 2:30 in the afternoon, the sidewalks along 125th Street were crowded with shoppers moving between stores, workers taking late lunch breaks, and residents conducting errands at the various businesses that lined Harlem's main commercial corridor. Margaret Moultrie Johnson was 58 years old, someone who had moved to Harlem from Charleston, South Carolina, 16 years earlier to be near her children after her husband William had died. Margaret lived in a modest apartment on West 138th Street and worked as a domestic worker for several white families in Manhattan, traveling by subway to clean their homes and care for their children. Margaret was known as a dignified religious woman who attended church regularly and who maintained high standards of behavior and appearance despite working in low-wage employment that often involved demeaning treatment from employers. On the afternoon of March 12th, Margaret was walking along 125th Street after finishing work at one of her cleaning jobs. Margaret was wearing her work clothes, a simple dark dress and coat appropriate for domestic labor, and was carrying a small bag containing her belongings. Margaret was tired after several hours of physical work and wanted to sit down briefly before taking the subway home. Margaret approached a restaurant called Morrison's Dining Room, which was located on 125th Street near Lenox Avenue, and which advertised itself as serving quality meals at reasonable prices. The restaurant had large windows facing the street and appeared to be approximately half full with customers eating late lunch. Margaret had never been to this restaurant before, but had passed it many times and had observed that it seemed like a respectable establishment where working people could afford to eat. Margaret entered the restaurant through the front door at approximately 2:45. The interior was clean and well-maintained, with tables covered in white cloths and waitresses moving between customers. Margaret stood near the entrance, waiting to be seated, following the protocol she understood was expected in restaurants that had table service rather than counter service. A man who appeared to be the restaurant's manager or owner approached Margaret after approximately 30 seconds. This man, who was approximately 50 years old and white, with thinning gray hair and wearing a white shirt with black vest, did not greet Margaret or ask how many people would be dining. Instead, the man stated that the restaurant did not serve colored people and that Margaret would need to leave. Margaret felt surprise and confusion at this statement because she knew that many black residents of Harlem ate at restaurants on 125th Street and because nothing about Morrison's dining room had indicated that it excluded black customers. Margaret stated politely that she simply wanted to sit and have a cup of coffee and that she would pay for her order like any other customer. The man, whose name was Charles Morrison and who owned the restaurant, stated more firmly that his establishment did not serve Negroes and that Margaret needed to leave immediately. Morrison's voice was loud enough that other customers in the restaurant turned to look at what was happening near the entrance. Several white customers who were eating lunch watched the interaction with expressions that ranged from indifference to amusement. Margaret stood near the entrance feeling acute humiliation as Morrison waited for her to leave, while other customers observed the scene. Margaret understood that she had no recourse. Businesses in 1936 could legally refuse service based on race, and arguing with Morrison would only extend her public humiliation without changing the outcome. Margaret turned without speaking further and walked out of the restaurant. and moving quickly away from the entrance while trying to maintain her dignity despite knowing that people inside were watching her leave. Margaret walked 2 blocks away from Morrison's dining room before stopping at a different restaurant that she knew served black customers. Margaret sat at the counter and ordered coffee, but she found that she had little appetite and felt unable to shake the sense of violation from what had just occurred. The incident at Morrison's had not involved physical violence or threats, but the public rejection and the knowledge that Morrison had treated her as unworthy of basic service in a public establishment felt deeply degrading. Margaret took the subway home to her apartment on West 138th Street, arriving at approximately 4 o'clock. And Margaret's son Ellsworth, known as Bumpy, had been living in Harlem for 17 years at this point and was 30 years old. Bumpy had established himself in Harlem's criminal economy, working initially as a bodyguard and enforcer and gradually building connections and authority within the illegal gambling operations that constituted a major part of Harlem's economic life. Bumpy maintained close relationships with his mother and sister Mabel and visited his mother regularly at her apartment. Bumpy arrived at Margaret's apartment that evening at approximately 6:30, as he often did several times per week, to check on his mother and to bring her money to supplement her meager wages from domestic work. Bumpy immediately noticed that his mother seemed troubled and asked what had happened. Margaret initially stated that nothing was wrong, but Bumpy persisted, and Margaret eventually described the incident at Morrison's dining room that afternoon. Bumpy listened to his mother's account without visible reaction, but those who knew him understood that such stillness indicated intense focus and anger held carefully under control. Bumpy asked specific questions about the restaurant's location, about Morrison's appearance and demeanor, about what exactly Morrison had said, and about whether other customers had witnessed the incident. Margaret answered thoroughly, still feeling upset by the memory of standing in the restaurant entrance while Morrison and other customers had treated her as someone who could be dismissed without consequence. Bumpy did not tell his mother what he intended to do about the situation, and Bumpy simply stated that Morrison's behavior had been unacceptable and that his mother should not worry about the matter further. Bumpy stayed with Margaret for another hour, speaking about other topics and ensuring she felt calmer before he left her apartment. As Bumpy walked away from his mother's building that evening, he thought carefully about what had occurred and what it represented. The immediate problem was that Charles Morrison had publicly humiliated Bumpy's mother by refusing her service based solely on her race. But Bumpy recognized that Morrison's action represented a broader pattern of discrimination that affected all black residents of Harlem who faced constant reminders that they were considered inferior and unwelcome in establishments that served white customers. Bumpy understood that responding effectively required addressing both the specific insult to his mother and the systemic discrimination that Morrison represented. Simply threatening or harming Morrison personally would accomplish little. Morrison might be frightened into serving black customers, but his business would continue operating. Other businesses on 125th Street would continue discriminating, and the underlying dynamic where white business owners felt entitled to exclude black customers would remain unchanged. What was needed was a response that would destroy Morrison's business completely, that would create deterrent effects, making other business owners reconsider their discriminatory policies, and that would demonstrate to Harlem's black community that racial insults would trigger consequences that white business owners could not withstand. This required systematic economic destruction rather than individual revenge. Bumpy spent March 13th gathering intelligence about Charles Morrison and his business operations. Bumpy enlisted 8 trusted associates who conducted investigation into who Morrison was, how his business operated, where his supplies came from, who his customers were, what financial obligations he had, and what vulnerabilities could be exploited. The investigation revealed extensive information within 48 hours. Morrison had owned his restaurant on 125th Street for 12 years. The restaurant was moderately successful, serving primarily white customers who worked in businesses along 125th Street or who traveled through Harlem on their way to other parts of Manhattan. Morrison purchased food supplies from several vendors, including a produce distributor in the Bronx, a meat supplier in Lower Manhattan, and a bakery that operated in Harlem. Morrison employed 6 staff members, including 2 cooks, 3 waitresses, and a dishwasher. Morrison had a mortgage on the building where the restaurant operated and had outstanding loans with 2 banks for equipment purchases and working capital. Most significantly, the investigation revealed that Morrison's restaurant depended heavily on black workers and black-owned suppliers, even while refusing to serve black customers. Morrison's dishwasher and one of his cooks were black Harlem residents. The bakery that supplied Morrison's bread was owned by a black entrepreneur. Several of the vendors who delivered produce and meat to Morrison hired black workers who handled deliveries. Morrison's restaurant existed within an economic ecosystem where black labor and black businesses were integral to operations, yet Morrison felt entitled to exclude black customers from his establishment. Bumpy recognized that Morrison's dependence on black workers and suppliers created vulnerabilities that could be systematically exploited. Bumpy also recognized that Morrison's business depended on customers who traveled through Harlem, meaning that Morrison needed Harlem residents to tolerate his presence on 125th Street even while he discriminated against them. This tolerance could be withdrawn. Bumpy spent March 14th and 15th developing a comprehensive strategy that would operate through multiple channels simultaneously. The strategy involved cutting off Morrison's labor supply, cutting off his food supplies, driving away his customer base, creating financial pressure through his creditors, and mobilizing community opposition that would make operating on 125th Street impossible. The first component was labor action. Bumpy instructed associates to speak with Morrison's black employees, the dishwasher and the cook, and to offer them employment at other establishments at higher wages. Both men were informed that Morrison had publicly humiliated an elderly black woman by refusing her service, and that continuing to work for Morrison meant supporting someone who treated black people with contempt. Both employees agreed to quit Morrison's restaurant effective immediately, with new jobs arranged through Bumpy's network. The second component was supply disruption. Bumpy contacted the owner of the bakery that supplied Morrison's bread and explained what Morrison had done to Margaret Johnson. The bakery owner agreed to stop selling to Morrison immediately. Bumpy also contacted the produce distributor and meat supplier who provided Morrison's food, explaining the situation and indicating that their businesses would face consequences if they continued supplying someone who discriminated against black customers in Harlem. Both suppliers agreed to stop delivering to Morrison's restaurant. The third component was customer disruption. Bumpy organized daily pickets outside Morrison's restaurant, featuring black residents carrying signs stating that Morrison discriminated against Negro customers and that patrons should eat elsewhere. The pickets were peaceful and legal, but created social pressure on white customers entering Morrison's establishment, forcing them to walk past black protesters while heading to a restaurant that refused to serve black people. Many customers found this uncomfortable enough that they chose to eat elsewhere. The fourth component was financial pressure. Bumpy contacted the banks that had extended loans to Morrison and indicated through intermediaries that Morrison's business was failing and that the loans might become difficult to collect. The banks began pressuring Morrison for faster repayment or additional collateral, creating cash flow problems for Morrison's operations. The fifth component was community mobilization. Bumpy worked with ministers at several Harlem churches who announced from their pulpits that Morrison's dining room on 125th Street discriminated against Negro customers and that the church congregations should avoid the establishment and should encourage others to do the same. These announcements reached thousands of Harlem residents who might otherwise have been unaware of Morrison's policies. The sixth component was competitive pressure. Bumpy arranged for a new restaurant to open directly across the street from Morrison's dining room. This new restaurant, operated by a black entrepreneur whom Bumpy provided with initial capital, offered similar food at lower prices and prominently advertised that all customers were welcome, regardless of race. The new restaurant immediately attracted both black customers and white customers who preferred eating in establishments that did not discriminate. These 6 components began operating simultaneously on March 16th, 5 days after Morrison had refused to serve Margaret Johnson. The cumulative effects created immediate and escalating problems for Morrison's business. By March 17th, Morrison discovered that both his dishwasher and one of his cooks had quit without notice. Morrison attempted to hire replacements but found that black workers were unwilling to work for him once they learned about his discriminatory policies. White workers who might have accepted the jobs demanded higher wages than Morrison could afford to pay. By March 18th, Morrison's supplies of bread, produce, and meat stopped arriving. Morrison contacted his suppliers and was informed that they would no longer serve his establishment. Morrison attempted to find alternative suppliers, but discovered that vendors were reluctant to work with him after word spread through supplier networks about the situation. Morrison was forced to purchase supplies at retail prices from grocery stores, significantly increasing his costs. By March 19th, pickets appeared outside Morrison's restaurant, carrying signs identifying the establishment as discriminatory. The pickets appeared every day at lunch and dinner time, creating constant visible reminder that Morrison refused service to black customers. Morrison's regular customers began eating elsewhere to avoid the discomfort of walking past protesters, and Morrison's receipts dropped by approximately 60% within 3 days. By March 21st, Morrison received letters from both banks that had extended him loans demanding accelerated repayment schedules. Morrison did not have cash reserves to meet these demands, while also facing increased costs for supplies and labor and decreased revenue from lost customers. By March 23rd, the new restaurant across the street opened with substantial business. Morrison watched customers, including several who had previously eaten at his establishment, crossing the street to eat at the competing restaurant that welcomed all customers. Morrison realized that his refusal to serve black customers, which he had maintained for 12 years without apparent consequences, was now directly causing his business to fail. Though Morrison attempted several strategies to address the crisis, Morrison tried to explain to the picketers that he would begin serving black customers if they would stop protesting, but the picketers stated that simply changing policy was insufficient. Morrison needed to leave 125th Street entirely because Harlem residents would not forgive his years of discrimination. Morrison attempted to negotiate with his suppliers to resume deliveries, but suppliers stated they could not afford to associate with someone who had generated such controversy. Morrison attempted to convince his banks to extend more time for loan repayment, but banks stated that his business appeared to be failing and that they needed to protect their investments. By early April, approximately 3 weeks after Morrison had refused to serve Margaret Johnson, Morrison's business was approaching collapse. Morrison's revenue had dropped by more than 75% due to lost customers. His costs had increased substantially due to higher labor expenses and retail prices for supplies. He faced loan payments he could not meet. The daily pickets continued drawing attention to his business and driving away the few remaining customers. The competing restaurant across the street was thriving, while Morrison's establishment was dying. On April 8th, approximately 4 weeks after the initial incident, Morrison closed his restaurant permanently. Morrison posted a notice on the front door stating that the establishment was closed until further notice, but Harlem residents understood that this closure would be permanent. Morrison attempted to sell the business, but no buyers emerged because everyone recognized that Morrison's dining room had been destroyed as a viable enterprise through systematic economic pressure. The building where Morrison's restaurant had operated remained empty for several weeks. In May 1936, a black entrepreneur purchased the building and opened a new restaurant that welcomed all customers. The new establishment thrived, serving both black and white customers in an integrated environment that reflected Harlem's demographics and that demonstrated that discriminatory policies were not necessary for business success. The destruction of Morrison's business created effects that extended far beyond one restaurant on 125th Street. Business owners throughout Harlem who had maintained discriminatory policies began reconsidering whether they could afford to offend black residents who might mobilize similar campaigns against their establishments. Several businesses that had previously refused service to black customers quietly changed their policies without public announcemements, simply beginning to serve all customers without making explicit statements about the change. The demonstration that a white-owned business could be destroyed completely within 1 month through coordinated economic pressure created confidence among Harlem residents that racial discrimination in commercial establishments could be challenged effectively without requiring legal action or violent confrontation. Now, the success of the campaign against Morrison established a model that could be replicated. Identify discriminatory businesses, cut off their labor and supplies, drive away their customers, create financial pressure, establish competing businesses, maintain sustained community pressure. The campaign also established precedent about consequences for insulting Bumpy Johnson's family. Everyone in Harlem understood that Morrison's business had been destroyed, not simply because Morrison discriminated against black customers generally, but because Morrison had specifically humiliated Bumpy's mother. This understanding reinforced Bumpy's reputation as someone who protected his family with absolute commitment and who had resources to destroy people who showed disrespect. For Margaret Johnson, on the resolution of the situation provided some satisfaction, but also discomfort. Margaret was gratified that Morrison had faced consequences for his discriminatory behavior and that his business had been destroyed. But Margaret was also troubled by the knowledge that her son had wielded power in ways that involved intimidation and economic coercion, even though no physical violence had occurred. Margaret never discussed the situation with others outside her family, maintaining the dignified silence that characterized her approach to most difficulties in life. For Bumpy, Morrison's destruction represented one example of how systematic strategic pressure could achieve outcomes that violence could not produce. Morrison had not been hurt physically, but he had lost his business, his income, his investment in the restaurant, and his position on 125th Street. The message to other business owners had been delivered clearly without requiring repeated demonstrations. Everyone understood that discriminating against black customers in Harlem carried risks that white business owners elsewhere did not face. The quiet effectiveness of the campaign, labor withdrawn within days, supplies cut off within a week, customers driven away within 2 weeks, competing business opened within 3 weeks, target business closed within 4 weeks, all accomplished through economic coordination rather than threats or violence, illustrated principles that would characterize Bumpy's most successful exercises of authority throughout his career. The story of how Charles Morrison had refused service to Bumpy Johnson's mother and how Morrison's business had collapsed within a month became one of many narratives that circulated in Harlem about Bumpy's protection of his community and family. The story emphasized the systematic nature of the response, the coordination of labor withdrawal, supply disruption, customer boycott, financial pressure, community mobilization, and competitive challenge, and the speed with which these coordinated actions had destroyed an established business. Whether remembered precisely or embellished through retelling, the narrative captured essential truths about how Bumpy understood power and how he exercised authority in Harlem. Protection of family was absolute. Racial insults triggered responses that were strategic rather than emotional. Economic pressure applied systematically across multiple domains could destroy opponents completely. Coordinating across different sectors, labor, suppliers, customers, financiers, community organizations, competitors, created leverage that individual actions could not achieve. Demonstrating capability to destroy businesses created deterrent effects that prevented future insults without requiring constant enforcement. The legacy extended beyond Morrison's individual case. The precedent that discriminatory businesses in Harlem faced coordinated economic destruction influenced how commercial establishments operated for years afterward. The demonstration that black workers, black suppliers, black customers, and black entrepreneurs could coordinate to destroy white-owned businesses that discriminated against black people created confidence in black economic power that would influence civil rights activism decades later. The success of the campaign against Morrison provided a template for economic boycotts that would become central tactics in the broader civil rights movement. These outcomes required no celebration or exaggeration to demonstrate their value. A mother's dignity had been defended. A discriminatory business had been destroyed. Other business owners had learned consequences for discrimination. The community had demonstrated coordinated power. Precedent had been established. Authority had been confirmed. The legacy endured. At the building where Morrison's dining room had operated became home to successive black-owned businesses over subsequent decades. Margaret Johnson lived another 14 years, until 1950, and never faced similar discrimination again because business owners throughout Harlem understood what had happened to Charles Morrison and what happened to people who disrespected residents connected to Bumpy Johnson. The quiet power of the resolution, documented, strategic, effective, lasting, stood in contrast to the dramatic narratives that often characterized stories about criminal figures. There was no violence, no theatrical confrontation, no spectacle. There was only systematic investigation, strategic planning, multi-pronged coordination, sustained execution, and complete destruction of an opponent's economic position through methods that were legal and effective and that created lasting changes in community power dynamics. This was the reality of how power operated when wielded by people who understood that systems required systematic responses, that economic relationships created vulnerabilities that could be exploited, and that real victories were measured not by dramatic moments, but by lasting transformations in how institutions functioned and how communities were treated.